So recently I've been doing some code consulting with someone within our community, and it's been coming up a couple times now that I start talking about code structure and architecture and where to put certain pieces of code. And it seemed to be helpful, and it made me think that maybe I should make a video for everyone where I actually go into one of my own personal projects, a live project actually, and talk about the different folder structure, the architecture that we're using, and where all the files live. This is mostly just to give you guys some inspiration as to how you guys might want to lay out your folders for your front-end project. This is going to be a Vue 3 project, but a lot of different frameworks like React or Vue, I work with both of them, and you can lay them out very similarly because you're just working with components, you're working with views, you're working with routers and stores. These are all very consistent across frameworks. So we're going to jump into one of my projects right now and take a look at how everything's working, and hopefully helping you guys gain some inspiration for your own projects. Alrighty, so we are chilling here. You can see this project is the Earthling dashboard. Now this is actually a live web application that is being used for our community on Discord. You can find our Discord in the link down below. You can sign up to this website from our Discord, connect your Discord account, your Twitch account, your Twitter account, and really it's just like a gamified, dashboard for the community. You gain some experience and you gain levels, and we'll be adding some more cool stuff in the future, but it's really just for fun for our community to sort of see who's the most engaged, and there's a leaderboard there with who has the most experience. And so all you really need to know about this project is it's a Vue 3 project. It uses Apollo and GraphQL to connect to a backend and to get data from a backend. It also has WebSockets in there. We'll be taking a look at briefly how that's implemented. Otherwise, it's pretty much just a normal dashboard. You've got views, you've got components. I try and split things up as much as possible, and we're using TypeScript as well. Otherwise, well, let's just jump into it. So at the root level, this is going to look very similar for a lot of projects because not a lot of this changes. You've got public here, and we can go into that a little bit. It's not super important. And source, which is where all of your files are pretty much going to be kept in nearly any front-end project you're working on. Next, we have a git ignore file. Hopefully you guys are a little bit aware with that. We're not going to be going into a lot of the code today. We're just going to be looking at the high level architecture of everything. We have Babel config, and a lot of this sort of stuff gets generated when I generate my Vue project using the Vue CLI. The more interesting stuff is we have a server.js, which we can look at briefly here. And this is actually serving my website when I deploy it live to Heroku. So we actually pretty much go through this exact process on our Vue 3 tutorial. If you're interested, go check that one out. We also have a Vue config. We have a package JSON, pretty much basic setup for a lot of front-end projects. Getting into the juicy stuff is going into the source folder. Now this folder is hopefully nice and neat. I like to try and organize things into areas that make the most sense, and this works for me so far. I will say right now in advance that things change constantly with how I organize my code. So this is probably just like the start of 2021 update, and I could redo this in a year and things could be quite different. But this is how I like to do things for the moment. So we have an assets folder. A lot of these probably won't change too much, or you might already have these. Assets folder, components folder. You'll also have probably a views folder, especially if you're working with Vue. You get automatically generated a views folder, and you might also have a types folder if you're using TypeScript, because that one seems pretty obvious to just throw a folder called types. There. The things that might be a little bit different or worded differently or used a bit differently, you've got things like GraphQL. This is where I store all of my GraphQL query and mutation and fragment strings. So we'll take a look at those. We also have a helpers folder. Now this is how I like to organize a lot of my code, is having helpers folder. This is a global sort of helpers folder, and we'll actually take a quick look at it now. This has I'm sorry if the internet's a bit slow. I'm staying in an Airbnb right now and the internet isn't the best. So we have, these are a few functions used throughout our application, or a collection of functions like this moment.ts that are used throughout our entire application. So that stays in the helpers folder right at the top of our source folder. None of this is too interesting. They pretty much do pretty basic stuff. Where we look at the moments one, we have a few functions in here just to handle dates. Yeah, that's where sort of the highest level functions are sitting. Now I'll show you guys later on, but I have other folders called helpers sitting within components and within views and stuff like that. So that's where functions specific to one part of the code are going to sit. So I can split them out. I don't have to have every single piece of logic and functions sitting in my components. I can split them out, but also keep them nice and neat in their own little folders nested deeply within other folders. So we'll take a look. First of all, assets is very, very straightforward. This is pretty much a bunch of images and icons. We've got achievements. So we've just got some PNGs here. We have icons. And so you pretty much just organize your assets folder into different areas that make the most sense. This is really not a hard folder to organize, and typically you don't have many images here. And ideally, long term, you probably wouldn't have many images stored here at all. You would have it all stored somewhere else. I have another website that has a lot of images it needs to look at, and those are all hosted on an S3 bucket with like a naming convention that makes it really easy to find those images dynamically. So after the assets folder, we have a components folder. Now, this is obviously going to be one of the biggest folders in your application, especially if you're using Vue or React. And so we'll jump in here. Now, the way I like to do component, you could just have the component file, every component file just sitting here. The way I prefer to do it is every single component has its own folder within the components folder. And what this allows us to do, for instance, we'll go to something like the register form. Right, and that's a pretty obvious component. It says what it does. It's the form to register for the website. And what we have here is the actual component, right, which is what you're being imported and putting into different pages. And then we have a helpers folder within that component. This is what I was talking about before. So if we go into that helpers folder, we actually have a validate email function. Now, this is a really simple function. You pass in an email, it does some regex and spits out whether or not the string you passed in is an email or not. And this is just like, obviously this isn't super necessary. It's saving 4 lines from our component, but I set these things up from the beginning of an application, just so I have that convention and that style and the architecture all ready for when things get bigger and bigger, because you really don't want to put yourself in a position where after working on a project for a few months, you now have to refactor the entire application because most of your components are like 500 lines long. So you really want to nip it in the bud before you've even gotten to that point and keep everything as small as possible. If we look into this, the whole component is about 112 lines, and even that's probably a bit long for me. We might be able to split some of this stuff out. I don't remember the last time I really looked at it. Yeah. I try and keep things as small as possible. I mean, a lot of these form items could probably be put into their own components, something to explore later on. But I would ideally like to keep this under 100 lines. But for 112, it's really not concerning myself this early on in the project, especially for like a fun little project for our community. Otherwise, everything else is pretty regular. I'm not sure what else would be interesting to look at here because they're all going to be pretty similar. If we look at maybe the achievements container, you can see in here that we don't have any helpers folder because we have no helpers. We have no helper functions or anything like that. This is also quite long. I was really trying to show off that I like to keep my files as short as possible. I guess this one does have a lot of styling necessary for the achievements, and the logic isn't too crazy. And you guys also get to have a little sneak peek at how I actually lay out an entire component. Not super the focus. The focus of this video is more the high level folder architecture, but this is sort of how an example of a component I've built somewhat recently, 22nd of December. Cool, so let's go back all the way to our source folder. And we'll take a look at the next folder in the list, which if my internet would like to load, there we go. It's GraphQL. Now, this is a very specific one to my project. If you're not using GraphQL to access a backend somewhere, it's really not going to be necessary or important to you, so we'll go over it very quickly. I like to organize my GraphQL folder into 3 subfolders: queries, mutations, and fragments. Potentially, if I was using subscriptions, that would be its own folder as well, I believe. But I don't know that I've done subscriptions with GraphQL yet. So I don't know. We'll have to see what I do when I get to that point. Mutations and queries are going to look pretty much the same, but just to keep the folders a little bit more split, I put them in their own sort of sections because you can end up with a lot of different folders, a lot of different files. So you can see here we already have about like 10 queries, and if we look at instance for one, This is the get me query. So this is just building a string. If you don't know much about GraphQL, you don't care about it, doesn't really matter too much, but this is, for instance, what one of these files looks like. And mutations are going to look pretty much exactly the same, except it'll say mutation here instead of query. The other interesting one is fragments. You saw I was importing a lot of fragments into that query. It just allows me to input a lot of fields and change, add a field to a user object, for example, across every single query without having to change multiple files. So this is just how I'm using fragments within GraphQL. And once I started using fragments, it was a lifesaver. I hadn't been using them for ages. I'd just been manually adding fields to every single query when I add a new field to a user, for example, and making fragments has helped a lot. Next up, we have helpers, which I've already gone into, and then we have plugins. Now, this is a really interesting folder, and I kind of have a vague description of what this folder does. It is kind of like a catch-all folder for technical things. I don't even know how to really explain it, so we'll go into it, and maybe you'll get a bit of an idea of how I've used it. So I only have two things in here, Apollo and Socket. These both handle, respectively, Apollo and sockets, WebSockets. So Apollo here, this is setting up some middleware and stuff for our Apollo client down the bottom here. And you'll see later on when we get to services where I start making API calls, that this Apollo client is being imported into something, and then we use this to make all of our calls. And so it's automatically handling a lot of the authorization from getting cookies and stuff. So this does a lot of cool stuff without us having to worry about it in every other API call we make. So we'll take a look a little bit more into what this actually does later on when we can see the code that actually calls that API. Well, the other plugin that we have here is called Socket. And this handles WebSockets using Socket.io, which is an awesome library to handle live real-time messages. And this is how we handle things like gaining experience or gaining levels. If you sign up to our website and you send a message on Discord and you've linked your Discord with your dashboard account, then you should see the experience go up in real time, which is pretty awesome. Not super necessary, but I like to just implement these things because it gives me a little bit more experience every time, and I get to organize the code a little bit better and just get a little bit better every time I implement something like this. So hopefully you can see what plugin sort of is. It's not like a single function. It's more like setting up a a feature kind of. But like an internal feature, not something that really the user sees. So yeah, that's what I like to use plugins for. Yeah, it's a little bit vague, but it makes sense to me. Next up, we have router, and this one's pretty straightforward. This is how we handle routing within our Vue application, and we use Vue Router for that. If you want to know more about how to implement Vue Router, that is also covered in my massive Vue 3 beginner tutorial, so definitely go check that out. So basically, we have all of our routes in here. We'll take a look at one of those, for instance, the home route. And we've just got basic home routes set up. So we've got the path, the name, the component, and I add my own meta flags here for requires login. And there's also one for requires admin. So we can just set that flag true on different routes that mean you need to be logged in or you need to be an admin to even see these. And then those are all being looked at in our before each file. Now, this is what's called a router guard, and it basically means before every single route that you go to within our application, this logic runs. And so it seems like this would slow down your app. There's a lot of logic happening here. Every time I click on a new page or something, this is all running. But most of the time, you're going to be logged in already, and you can see here by the second condition within this large sort of nested conditioning, is user loaded and is the platform loaded, then go next. And so most of the time when you interact with the site, you will hit this and then that's it. So not much logic is actually running. Otherwise, it sets up your entire user. It looks at your authentication in your cookies, and it says it gets your user information. If there's an error, it handles that. If you're not logged in, it pushes you to log in. It does a lot of awesome cool stuff. It also sets some state information for achievements and if the platform's loaded. So a lot of awesome stuff there. And then, oh wait, we missed one more. The index of the router is actually what sets everything up, pulls it all together. And the reason we've split everything before into a routes folder and to the before each file is now that this index is super clean and super small. So we basically create the router, we set the history mode on it, we just import the routes. The routes are exported as a list. They're all collected in that folder and exported as just one list with every single route. And then we add router before each, and then the before each function I just showed you before. And then we export it. And then that's imported later on when the Vue project actually starts up, which I will show you towards the end. Next up, we have services. Now, this is where all the cool stuff happens with actually making API calls. So it's a little bit less organized, and at some point I probably will have to organize these into some folders that make some logical sense, but right now they're all just sitting in here. So every one of these makes an API call to get some data back, and that's what I use the services folder for. So for instance, let's say login user. So if this loads, all this does, every single file looks very similar to this. The only difference between them is whether they're a mutation or a query, and that's probably how I would organize them in the future if I had to, into folders. It pulls the mutation string from the GraphQL mutations folder that we looked at earlier, and then passes in some variables. So you can just call this function, login user, with a username and a password, and it will return the login user data from the API. And it's really simple. If I added a new mutation on the back end, it would be very easy. All I would have to do is add the mutation query string in the GraphQL mutations folder, and then add the service that actually makes that call. And then I can use that wherever I want throughout my application. So everything is pretty standard. That's all the services. Every service pretty much looks pretty similar to that. And next we have the store. The store is always very interesting. People have their different ideas and conventions of how to use this. This is how I like to do it. So the index is what sets up the store, and I actually have some, I don't know, basic or platform-oriented state and mutations in here that didn't make sense to me to put into their own module. So we have set like anything related to achievements, and the platform being loaded, which is just a flag, true or false, have we loaded the platform yet? Which is basically a way of saying, have we fetched the user, have we fetched everything we need for the user to actually use the website? So these are sitting here. This is pretty straightforward. I make sure all my mutations are all capitalized with underscores. That's how I like to name my mutations, and I think it looks good. Actions are just camel case normally, and we'll see that when I head over to the user store. This is a module for the store, which is focused on the user. And so it stores the actual user object, online users, which is just a list of IDs, notifications, and also new achievements. So this is like achievement. Maybe this has to be refactored because there's achievements in the other one and new achievements here. This is more related to the user directly, and the achievements before is like all the achievements that are possible on the platform. So it makes a little bit of sense to me, but maybe there's a better way of organizing this in the future. We also have a bunch of mutations. I try and keep my mutations super small. 1 line if possible, 2 lines. The only one that's more than that is this, and there is likely a good reason for that. And everything else is 1 to 2 lines, because mutations really should be, all they should be doing is changing a field, changing a value, that's it. And it makes it easier for history tracking later on. Actions can be a little bit more complicated, making API calls, doing some complicated logic, and then they will eventually call mutations to change the state. So you can see I've got login user, update user, register user, and logout user, all pretty standard. Register and login are pretty much the same. Update user is very simple, and logout user just clears and resets everything to log you out. So that's what my user store looks like. And if you didn't notice before, if I forgot to point it out, when we set up the store, I just set the module here for the user store. So you can just use store.user and access everything within the user store, which makes it nice and clean when they have to use it within components. Alrighty, so we're getting down to the final folders. Types is, oh wait, we just skipped styles. Styles is very simple. We have a base folder. This is what's being imported on startup, and then it imports every other file that we have within here. So we only have to worry about importing the base CSS file, and everything else will come with it. And this just has some global stylings, you know, some basic stuff, box sizing, border box. You'll find that on nearly every website nowadays. Some basic stuff with the font family, the color, everything else. I mean, whenever I want to change, you know, for instance, all the H1s have no margin. You know, by default H1s or headers will have margins, and I don't like that, so I just get rid of it. Stuff like that. And I've put it under this little comment, CSS reset, to get rid of some default styling I don't like. We probably don't need to look into these animations. Just has some animations that you have for transitions, and variables is just some variables for different colors that we use, text colors and border colors. It's pretty much all coloring for now. Types is very, very simple. It's just the TypeScript types for our code base. So for instance, you got a user type here, and you got all the different fields. Nothing too crazy. If you're using TypeScript, you've probably already got this folder set up the exact same way. Nothing too crazy you can do with this one. And then the last folder we have here is views. Now this is automatically going to be set up if you set up a view project, and I like to think of it as the high level pages. So components, you have a view at the top, and then the view is made up of a bunch of smaller components. Now you can see here my home page is in a folder and everything else is not. And that's not for any special reason besides I want to put everything in a folder like I do with my components, but I only did my home page and then I forgot to do everything else. So that needs to be worked on in the future. But ideally I would have all of these in their own folders, and any logic necessary for that high level part of the page would have a helpers folder inside that would have the functions that are being called to try and keep the actual page component, this admin.view or error.view, as small and as clean as possible. So speaking of keeping things as small and as clean as possible, let's take a look at what the home page actually looks like. This is the main page of the app. This has had the most work put into it, and you can see it is about 50 lines. So you can see why I was getting a little bit annoyed. I had components before that were over 100 lines. Yeah, so very, very simple. It has a lot of code in it, but they're all nested within components, within components, within components. So like to keep it high level, very clean and easy. We've got a little bit of logic here just to grab the user from the state. That's all the setup is doing. And that's just because at this high level, we just have to condition the user for loading this one component. Otherwise, we have a little bit of styling, and then that's pretty much it. If we had any more logic here, it might go into its own helpers folder, but ideally try and split things up and put things into components as much as possible. Every other page looks very similar to that, so there's no reason to go into anything else further. And then we have the last few files here, so we're getting right to the end. So we've got app.view. This is the highest level component that you will find in at least a Vue project. So this holds everything, and every single page you saw before, the home page, the admin page, is all kept within this router view here. Otherwise, we have, again, this is as small as I can make it, 53 lines, so about the same as the home page. We've got some high level things, the sidebar, the notifications container, the achievements container, because both of those, when they trigger, they sit above everything. They pretty much take over your entire page when you get a notification or an achievement, for instance. And then you have the view, which is holding every page that you go to, whether it's the home page or whatever. This is what actually changes when you click on a page. The sidebar should pretty much always be there unless you're logging in. So we have a few logic here. Don't show the sidebar if you're on the login page, the register page, or the error page for the site. Otherwise, show the sidebar. Yeah, small, easy, and clean. I'm quite happy with it for now, although it might get messy in the future. And the shims.view, I'm going to skip the main for now. The shims.view or dash view is automatically set up by TypeScript. I can't remember if I changed it slightly to fix a bug, but otherwise it's pretty insignificant. And then our main.ts is what actually sets up our Vue project. So this uses the store, it injects the store, injects the router, injects element plus. This is the first time I've used this UI library and I actually enjoy it so far. View recapture, so we can put some capture on our register, because we did have an issue with someone just throwing a bunch of bots and registering thousands of accounts. So that's all sorted now. And then it mounts the app on anything with the with the ID of app, which there should only be one in your application. And that's pretty much it. That's our entire application from front to back. Hopefully you guys gained something from this. It was kind of a bit of fun for me to just go through the project and talk about my code and why I do certain things. If you guys have any questions or you want me to do a deep dive into certain areas of my code, definitely let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.